more extra dimensional, if you will. Actually, the message that was used is I was told that you can best understand us as coming from what you would call the afterlife.
Per coloro che non ne sono ancora a conoscenza, è in arrivo la seconda parte dell'iniziativa di Jake Barber, un progetto ambizioso che mira a dimostrare al mondo l'esistenza degli UFO e la possibilità di evocare questi oggetti volanti attraverso l'uso degli psionici o medium, a seconda delle preferenze lessicali. Questa iniziativa è finanziata privatamente, infatti ad oggi i tentativi di coinvolgere il governo non hanno portato a risultati concreti. Tuttavia alcuni ex militari americani hanno deciso di prendere in mano la situazione e fare tutto il possibile per portare avanti il progetto. Questo aspetto è ironico, per non dire inquietante, ma ci siamo ormai abituati a situazioni di questo tipo. Il progetto Skywatcher, come ha dichiarato Jake Barber, conta su circa un centinaio di persone attivamente coinvolte. Jake ha espresso la sua convinzione che riusciranno a raggiungere il loro obiettivo fin dal primo tentativo. Il loro scopo è evocare un velivolo a forma di uovo, e all'evento hanno addirittura invitato un gruppo di persone comuni, a patto che fossero residenti negli Stati Uniti. In un altro tweet, Barber ha recentemente sottolineato che hanno decine di ore di video che stanno editando, che condivideranno metodologie e risultati nei prossimi 6 mesi, suggerendo quindi che lui e il suo team saranno i protagonisti della narrazione in questo 2025. Per promuovere l'evento è stato anche realizzato un trailer, come se si trattasse di un film o di un evento musicale.
It's a game of chess, right? If this is an advanced species and is smart enough to do what it's doing, they're probing us, they have the upper hand, and we are the little ants under the magnifying glass.
La seconda parte di questa iniziativa è molto attesa e dovrebbe essere rilasciata a breve, forse già questo venerdì. In attesa del rilascio, oggi pubblichiamo un'intervista con uno degli psionici coinvolti, probabilmente la più interessante e approfondita. Le domande e le risposte sono molto rilevanti, con dichiarazioni di grande importanza. Oggi infatti sentiremo che questi velivoli a forma di uovo provengono dall'aldilà, dall'afterlife, e dentro non ci sono esseri biologici.
The memory as a kid is of a psychic experience. I was 4 years old. I was sitting on a kitchen countertop and I fell off at just the right angle and I hit my head, broke my arm, and then I separated from my body. I can still to this day remember, basically floating above my physical form, which is on the ground crying, and just thinking, this is an odd experience. And my life going forward from there was kind of a series of, similar, strange, anomalous occurrences. And as a child, I grew up in Texas, typical kind of Protestant upbringing, and I learned that, these are not subjects that everyone necessarily wants to hear about. Things like, having premonitions of my grandfather dying before he actually did, or, there was a large wooded area behind our house where I spent a ton of time as a kid, and I would, see things out there, various spirits, land spirits, whatever you'd like to call them. And so I just, kind of internalized this as a kid. Now, on the flip side of that, I actually grew up with the UFO topic being very front and center in my life. My grandfather was an Air Force intelligence officer at Roswell. He was first sent there on TDY in 1947 from Carswell Air Force Base. He's serving under General Ramey. So the lines kind of add up there. And then my mom was actually born in Roswell in 1950. So the UFO topic has always been, perfectly acceptable in my family. And as kids typically do, you gravitate towards the other side of that. So I was always much more interested in kind of those, mystical, spiritual experiences. And mind you, this was, early 90s growing up. There wasn't the internet. I didn't have really much of a way to learn from others as to what this was. The only real resource you had back then was Barnes and Noble's New Age section, which wasn't all that complete, let's say. So just kind of had to stumble through these things and, go off to college. And in 2003, I had my first major contact experience. I was up in Middlebury, Vermont, and I There was an event where I had 3 hours of missing time, and I also was physically moved about a mile from my last conscious memory. And so to this day, that's something I'm still kind of processing. But the way it presented itself, I didn't actually immediately associate that with the UFO phenomenon. I did see entities before my conscious memory, kind of went away, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. And it wasn't until many years later, as an adult, I had a boss of mine. I told him about this experience, and he recommended Valet's Passport to Magonia. And that was the first time that I began to really understand the weirdness of all of this and kind of the interrelation between those two.
Now, this contact experience you just referenced, was it elicited out of your own intention, or did it happen spontaneously?
It happened spontaneously. I was actually with a number of friends when it occurred, and I lost track of them, kind of lost my bearings, wasn't sure where I was. And after the event, I was studying at Middlebury College. I came to in my dorm. I was just walking in my dorm. That's like my next memory, despite having previously been out in the woods. And I went and knocked on a friend's door. I was angry and confused. And I said, what the heck, man, you left me out there. And he said, James, we couldn't find you. That was 3 hours ago. We all thought you went home early. We weren't sure what happened.
How did you get introduced to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing, how did you get introduced to protocols and contact field work?
So contact work is something that has always happened to me throughout my life, and that's taken various guises. A lot of people are familiar with, kind of classic mediumship. NHI communication has always been a piece of that, and it was only something that I began to have a really concerted effort at once I understood kind of the overlap of these two things, as I was referring to earlier. It was actually Dr. Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, was the first time that I really felt like someone really got this in terms of the breadth of what these entities might be. And so, I was doing this, with a number of smaller private groups. And finally, I guess it was summer of 2023, I realized I wanted to find a way to do this in a much bigger way. So I started looking for who else was out there that was trying to do something big in the space between the overlap of UAP and consciousness. And at that point, that's where I was introduced to Alex Klokas. This was still very much in the infancy of what has become of Skywatcher and some of the other initiatives around it. And from there, as we began this, I don't think either of us were really entirely sure where it was going to go. At first there was a very heavy UAP focus. And then as we begin to meet and network with various people in the space, whistleblowers, scientists, et cetera, we're immediately pushed back into that consciousness side of things, that consciousness is fundamental to understanding this. That's really where your efforts need to be. And so myself, with the background that I have, I spend a great deal of time, networking with psychic individuals, figuring out what are the capabilities and limitations of this ability, because I really, largely have my own experiences to stand on and find, there is a wide breadth of experience out there. And so moving forward, I'm hands down working on this. This past summer, summer of 2024, Alex reaches out to me and says, hey, we met this individual that is part of the crash recovery team that ended up being, Jake Barber. At the time, I only knew Jake as a pseudonym when I was first introduced to me. And, the other whistleblowers that I've met, I've been a little bit cagey with my own psychic experiences. Most of them are very open to consciousness and they want to hear about it, but there still is a little bit of a stigma there. And the first time I spoke to Jake, that was the first thing he wanted to talk about. He was very curious about, Alex had told him about my own experiences and was very curious to learn more. And so that was a real breath of fresh air, and to me was very validating as to how serious this topic is taken.
Yeah. Recently, it was reported by Ask a Poll that Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, he's concerned that UFO whistleblower Jim Baker is a plant. Jake Baker, excuse me, is a plant. And then I saw someone comment and say that he perceives that religious people as Tim Burchett is, tend to feel a little squeamish, if you will, about the activity of summoning UAP. Do you think religious people should be concerned about it? Is it are there dangers? Are such endeavors problematic for their spiritual beliefs and faith? How do you unwind that?
Yeah, so to unwind that, this is part of the human experience. This is reported in virtually every culture throughout the history of humanity, and probably long before we have written records of it. It's always been there. It's really the paradigm in which we choose to view those experiences and what these entities actually are. And so I think at this point, actually ascribing a belief system to what this is when we have so little evidence seems very perfunctory to me. And I know, if you come at this from a Judeo-Christian background, this quickly becomes, a dualistic good versus evil. There are plenty of other cultures out there that view this as something that exists outside of material reality that we just don't often have the ability to peer into, whether that be, the jinn, the fairy, the devas, etc. And so I think we're real quick as humans to try to ascribe labels to things. I don't think it fits very well for where we're at today. Now, as to answer your question about whether or not this is dangerous, I don't find this to be dangerous myself. I've done this for a long time. Now, the one caveat I always put with this is your own baggage as an individual can be brought into these experiences. And so if you have negative preconceived notions as to what this phenomenon is, it sometimes can manifest in that way. Now, I think the work done in order to integrate those experiences allows for a much richer experience of the phenomenon as a whole.
On your website, you have a website, ennea.io. I think ennea, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, is Greek and it means 9. But on your website, you have a couple quotes on your website. One of them is, or sentiments. One of them is, what if your thoughts had the ability to shape reality? Not figuratively, but literally. You also have on your website, reality is programmable. We are the programmers. What's your perspective on our thoughts and how in its relationship to reality?
Yeah, so this is a complicated, very fascinating subject. And I think it gets to, all the interest and fear and uncertainty around human initiated contact experiences as to, what are these craft? What is being manifested? And, this still is a largely unknown area. The fact that, thought seems to be accessing some type of field, whether you want to call it the 0-point energy field or, what have you, and be able to manipulate matter and actually have physical results, whether that be seeing something in the sky or some type of tangible craft or material that ends up on the ground. Now, I also don't want to discount the fact that there are biologics that are often involved in these experiences, not always, to be clear, but even our definition of biologics, I think, needs some reinterpretation and openness to new information. There are reports, and Jake talked a little bit about the emotional experiences that he had while flying the helicopter, that not all of these craft are even necessarily occupied, but the craft themselves can be sentient, which is really asking for a redefinition of what life is. And so I guess to get back to the crux of your main question around thoughts being able to manipulate reality, I would argue that this is actually kind of part of the American tradition in a certain way. If you look at Neville Goddard and the New Thought movement, this is something, the power of positive thinking. These are ideas that many people, particularly in the US, have thought, and they've ascribed a Protestant understanding to it, typically Protestant understanding to it, and that's fine. But what you're talking about is your thoughts and your positive intentions influencing reality and getting real world results.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. Whitley Strieber was recently on the Jesse Michaels show, and I didn't watch the whole thing, but he was, I think, and I'm pretty sure he's brought this up before. Some people believe that, and I just want your take on this. Obviously, it's speculative, but some people believe that this phenomenon, whatever it is, for it to have more access to humanity, it requires that more human beings know it exists or believe it exists. Do you have any perspective on that idea?
I've heard that idea. I tend to disagree with it, though, because there are times throughout history where superstition has been absolutely rampant. Think of the burning times in Europe. If we're ascribing that there is something, that this is a fully spiritual experience and that it's negative, well, the time where, literally everyone was seeing demons behind every corner would lead you to believe then that these entities could then come through at will and, wreak havoc.
Yeah. So you wrote on X, why should we wait for governments to disclose the truth when the people have the power to do it themselves? What power do we have, in your perspective, to actually get transparency of this phenomenon in terms of our knowledge and understanding without having to wait for governments to open the books?
I think there's a few different ways. First and foremost is individual experience. And all the efforts of Skywatcher aside, my concern is that there's no amount of footage or evidence or proof that can convince everyone. Now, what Skywatcher can do is actually, and Jake has said we're doing this, is host events to actually show the reality of this to individuals. I also think the ability to do this is accessible, not necessarily to everyone, but the people that are willing to put in the work, required to develop the skill, I think they can do this at home. And I really think in order for disclosure to happen, it's going to take a great deal of personal exposure. Once again, we can show the best footage in the world, and I think people are still going to tear it apart. I think you really need that personal firsthand experience. We're going to do our best. We have a lot of plans that are coming over the next few months, but I would, challenge people, if you're going to say that this is impossible, give it a shot first.
Yeah, I know that Jake Barber, in one of the interviews, I think he said something to the effect that you can persuade the UAP to actually land. Now, I know you guys had an outing and you got some interesting imagery, but from my understanding, the craft or the egg was moving so fast you couldn't see it with the naked eye. Do you think it's doable that you could actually get one of these eggs to land, or is that something that the egg would only be willing to do within the confines of some kind of aerospace company activity?
So there are numerous reports, over the past, in the 20th century, of material being gifted. Now, what the exact circumstances were for that, I am not sure. I think a lot of it was just luck of the draw in terms of, people having to be in the right place at the right time. And I think that is potentially a repeatable process. And that's one of the things that we're working out right now.
Yeah. How did the legacy program even come up with the idea to have psionic assets? Where did they get that idea? Where did that come from?
So this gets back to, a lot of the early U.S. government interest in psi. And, for the legacy program in particular, I'm going to make some speculations, but, most people don't realize that U.S. interest in psi phenomenon actually comes from the Soviets. In the early 1970s, there were reports of what the Soviets called psychotronic research. The Soviets were always much more accepting of these ideas. And so you saw, throughout the 70s, the development of programs such as Stargate that were looking at what are the practical applications of psionic abilities. And, Stargate being a remote viewing program, viewing real world targets is a great example. Now, from there, you obviously get into pushing the envelope as to what's possible. And that term, psionic asset, people have asked me, what does that mean exactly? And to be fair, I don't love the term, but the definition of it could easily be ascribed to this is using psychic abilities for real world applications. It's not just mediumship, etc.
Oh, one of the interesting parts of one of the interviews, Jake Barber said that we intentionally disconnect the psionic asset so that the HPM, I guess that's high power microwave systems, can be energized because there are some potential issues that can happen if the psionic asset is still connected to the craft when it's hit with an EMP or other HPM. So can you elaborate on that? If you are psychically connected with the craft itself and something happens negatively to the craft, is that true that it could actually impact your physical health?
So the concern would be that when the pilot is actually operating the craft, that there is a piece of their consciousness that is disassociated from their physical self and is attached to that craft. Now, I will say that what Jake is talking about is the way this was done in the legacy programs, where they actually would use, psionic assets and then they would take that craft down. That's not something we're doing. If we were doing that, we would have done it already and not told everyone about it. So we really are simply using psionic assets to try to get this material on the ground without there being any type of kinetic or directed energy response.
What about any machine-based summoning systems? Do you harness anything like that?
So I'm aware of those. I have not used those. I have not been a part of that.
What's your best hypothesis as to like the egg, just as an example? Do you have any hypothesis of what is created those eggs, the intelligences behind them, why they're here, their origin, and so forth?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So you heard Jake, and I think it was in the Jesse Michaels interview, talks about 8 different class of craft that they have encountered. The eggs and the orbs are 2 particularly interesting ones in that as I understand it, the eggs are typically not piloted, so there's not a biologic within those. And my interactions with them has led me to believe that this is likely some type of manifestation, as you were asking about earlier. One of my areas that I, kind of pride myself on is NHI communication. And some of the messages that I've received about what these craft actually are is more extra dimensional, if you will. Actually, the message that was used is I was told that you can best understand us as coming from what you would call the afterlife, which obviously that puts a pretty wild, spiritual component to this.
How did you receive that message? Was this during an outing where you were trying to make contact? Or was it like communicated to you telepathically?
Yes. So this was actually while we were out filming for that first Skywatcher documentary. We did a session. It was about a 2-hour session. It was a pretty long one where trying to understand these craft more directly. And actually, Dr. Gary Nolan was curious how this all worked and volunteered to kind of lead the questioning piece of, what information I could get. And that was actually there's a few interesting bits that came out of that conversation. First, I could tell we reached a point in the conversation where whatever I was interacting with seemed also to be interfered with, similarly to how the pilot was. And so I started to get very agitated. I had a lot of emotions that weren't mine. Which is kind of odd in NHI communication. I don't really get a lot of emotional transference. And I could hear a voice saying basically, stop this. And that was in a lot of distress. And then the connection ended up getting severed. And this was really as we were trying to learn more about how, frankly, we can work together, how these craft operate. And so once again, there were kind of 2 instances where it felt like we were being interfered with.
When you received the message regarding the origin, I think you said that you got the impression they're like interdimensional from the afterlife. How unambiguous or murky was that, the reception of that message? How sure are you that it was coming from something outside of you and not just your own thinking mind on its own accord?
So this is the hardest part of all this. And this is why discernment is really critical. I'll tell you more about the session that Dr. Nolan and I did. And so it began with questions like that, where this information is purely coming from within me. And you're absolutely right. If there's no way to validate that information, it's largely hearsay. So all I can do is relay this is what I told and try to be objective and independent as to what that is. Now, where things get more interesting with channeling is, Dr. Nolan was curious about how, the download process would work. Is that something that we can actually do and document with Gary's scientific background? I'm a liberal arts guy. I don't really have any scientific background, nor do I have a great deal of interest in it. And so to start, Gary wanted to give me a test question. And the question he gave me, and it's funny the way he phrased it, is I'm going to ask you something I know a great deal about and you know nothing about. And he asked me to explain how an exotic vacuum object works. And so over the course of, probably 10 to 15 minutes, I was able to draw out a schematic of what an exotic vacuum object is and how it functions best we can understand. And I show this to Gary, and he turns around his computer and shows an image of a schematic that looked, very similar, convincing enough for him that there was something to this. And then from there, we started to explore and push the boundaries of, looking at more challenging problems, like problems that have not been addressed by physicists. Things like the energy storage issue in a Casimir battery. That's one of the issues we tackled. And so to your point, those channeled messages, they're interesting. And, there's hundreds of years of UFO channeled messages. There's the Urantia book, whatever this, IM material, set material, etc. All that's interesting. And it's, I guess it's entertaining to read, but you can't do much with that. And so that's where, this psionic asset element comes in once again, is that this is practical psi. Not so much that channeled information, but the fact that we can get reliable downloads is proof of non-local information, at least to myself.
Yeah. I think during the Ross Coulthart interview, he was asked, he asked Jake Barber, does this non-human intelligence want humanity to know about their existence? And Jake Barber said, yeah, I do believe that's the message that we're getting. So you felt that yourself, and there are others that I know of that are being sent that message directly, and they are extremely confident. So what is your take on that? Whatever is engaging humanity, do you feel like they want us to collectively know of their presence?
Well, so I think you inadvertently hit on the crux of this problem. Is I don't think this is just one thing. I think there is a diversity of motivations and, whether you want to call them biologics, entities, spirits, etc., that are all at play with this. And, the difficulty in receiving these messages, once again, is the power of discernment. And, really having a great deal of confidence that who you're talking to is who they claim to be, and that they have your best interest at heart. That's always a little bit concerning. Conversely, because Skywatcher has a team that can do this and resources to do it, if one of these is able to help us actually demonstrate to large groups of people, which, by the way, we have already done at INEA back in October, then that to me is proof that people do want us to. And, let's talk about that INEA event that was hosted at Esalen. I forget the exact number of people, anywhere from 40 to 60 individuals. Not all of them were, diehard believers. There were a number of skeptics in there that found consciousness interesting enough to, come down to Esalen.
What is the Explorers Club exactly? Because I've seen the Explorer Club on your NEA.io website, and I've also heard Jake Barber reference the Explorers Club.
Mm-hmm. So INEA itself is the Explorers Club. And the idea behind that was, going back to, that classic kind of Victorian idea of an Explorers Club where, people are going to get out there into kind of pushing back the edges of the map back then in terms of our understanding of, different cultures and places, et cetera. But this is an Explorers Club that's strictly geared towards consciousness. And I think that's, having watched all of the dialogue online since the News Nation piece came out and then our own, and seeing all this fear around what we're doing and good versus evil, and you're not sure of what you're going to get when you do these activities, I don't think it's necessarily for everyone, but I do feel like, for those people that are called to kind of like push back the edges of the proverbial map once again, this is that uncharted territory that people are looking for. And, even in the experiences that have been, shocking throughout my life, they haven't been so discouraging that I wanted to push back from the table and, just lead a mundane existence afterwards. It just kind of motivates you to go on.
What are your preferred protocols when you're trying to make contact with non-human intelligence?
So it's very person dependent. And I actually, from my team, the one we use at Skywatcher, there actually isn't a specific protocol that's used. And I know, CE5 is very popular. There's other derivations of that. I mean, for me, mine is a very like open, receptive partnership. I'm basically broadcasting that, we're here in a spirit of partnership. We'd love for you to show yourselves. And then once that contact takes place, then you're able to telepathically make requests. Like, if it's at night, say, move closer to Orion, move closer to the Big Dipper, flash your lights, things like that. So that's how contact's made. But that's just for me. There's another member of my team, that classic love and light contact protocol people talk about. When this guy sits down in that chair, that's what he's broadcasting, and they show up, in a heartbeat. So it really just depends on you as an individual.
AI has really just come onto the scene in a really significant way. I mean, AI has been around forever, but in terms of like access to AI, ChatGPT and Sora that makes videos and image making, and you can ask, ChatGPT is starting to address medical issues, and it's really sophisticated. Do you think that that AI coming online, if you will, and we're kind of moving so much closer to disclosure, do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think that's some kind of cosmic alignment of sorts?
I'm inclined to think of it as a coincidence. I'm not, once again, I don't think ruling out any possible hypothesis is very wise at this juncture in disclosure. And so I'm open to the idea of some type of cosmic AI being a piece of this. I would go so far as I'm not against, the simulation hypothesis as well. And so it could play a role. Correlation isn't necessarily causation in my mind.
Do you think that Psi actually has more stigma than the UFO issue? And if so, why?
I do. I think if Jake's story would have been narrowly focused on simply rote crash retrieval, I think people would have been much more receptive. I think the story would have been much more widely covered. I hate to say it. And as to why that is, I think people can still grok the idea of aliens from Zeta Reticuli, and we just simply haven't had the technology to properly observe them or interact with them. The high strangeness around the psi angle of this, I unfortunately think is a lot to chew for normal people in society that aren't in this as deep as we are.
Do you have a theory about the hitchhiker effect? Because I know a lot of you people, when they have encounters with UFOs, it doesn't stop there. They'll have poltergeist activity or stuff like that happens afterward, which I guess could fall under the umbrella of the hitchhiker effect. Do you have any, theory as to why encountering UAP leads to this kind of hitchhiker experiences?
Yeah, so I think the hitchhiker effect viewed by itself is pretty scary. The fact that you're taking something home with you and there's going to be poltergeist phenomenon and things that are typically going to creep you and your family out. I think the much more common story, however, is that exposure to UAPs tends to open people up to a lot of positive experiences as well. This becomes something that is much more repeatable and a reminder that reality is a lot more interesting than we give it credit for. Now, I've heard the hitchhiker stories. I do believe them. I'm not sure what causes those for specific individuals, except for that comment I made earlier around if someone has some baggage from things that have happened in their past or preconceived notions as to what this is, sometimes the phenomenon can choose to manifest in that way. And once again, we're also dealing with a highly diverse phenomenon. And so exposure to one doesn't necessarily preclude something else saying, aha, I recognize James now and I'm going to go, mess with him.
I find it particularly wild, the idea that the components or aspects of the phenomena, because we, like you said, we might be dealing with many different things, but part of it might have something to do with the afterlife. That is about as mind-bending as you could possibly ever get. I mean, to me, that's more mind-bending than I can't think of anything more mind-bending than that. If that's true, how is the world going to digest that?
I have no idea. I really don't know. And when we talked about Enya and the Explorers Club, I also have a startup background, and we joke about, when you're building a startup, you're kind of assembling the airplane while it's in flight. And I think burying our heads in the sand as to what this is and saying we shouldn't explore it because we don't understand it and the potential ontological shock for humans is too great, I think is grossly irresponsible. I tend to rail against, scientific materialism, but that really goes against, everything that we have been built on since the Enlightenment. I like to think that we're seeing a kind of commingling of different cycles of humanity, wherein previously, we were very superstitious, but these experiences were much more accepted. Move on to the Enlightenment, everything becomes scientific materialism. I think now we're going towards a synthesis of these two things, and it doesn't necessarily need religion as an explanation. It's okay for reality to be a lot stranger than we accept without necessarily having to just ascribe a label to it. But I do think, to your point about the afterlife, this is proof that we live on after death. And I can't think of anything more important than that, particularly, the hole that seems to exist in the West right now in terms of meaning, the crisis of meaning. And I do think the reality of our spiritual sides and the immortality of that, regardless of the paradigm one chooses to ascribe to it, that's what's so important here.
What kind of changes in civilization do you anticipate will happen after disclosure?
I struggle with this question, trying to define its disclosure. And I think disclosure would be defined as the universal acceptance of non-human intelligence or life, life being obviously a very broad interpretation. As to what changes with that, I think there will be numerous technological breakthroughs that these ideas can no longer be hidden behind closed doors. I am a firm believer that there has been technological advancements that have been made based off the recovery of this material, which obviously that means there's something quite physical there. It's not just the spiritual side that we're talking about. And those inventions have the ability to drastically upend society. Now, one of my favorite quotes is by kind of a public intellectual named Daniel Schmachtenberger. And he said, "We have all the power of gods with none of the wisdom to wield it," or something to that effect. And the dual use nature of some of this technology obviously is a little bit concerning. And so I think we as a civilization have a lot of growing up to do in order to use this technology responsibly.
What do you think is behind the suppression of the UFO issue? The cover-up has been going on for 70 plus years. Corporations that allegedly got all the goodies, the two corporations that come to my mind in particular are Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. I'm sure other corporations have gotten their hands on these technologies. What is it greed? Is it greed that's primarily behind wanting to keep 8 billion people out of the loop? What's your take? What's your hypothesis on why there is so much effort to keep this from coming into the public domain?
I think it's a few things, but first and foremost, I think this inadvertently became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what I mean by that is my take in speaking with people that were part of the legacy program, other whistleblowers over the past couple of years, is everyone is worried about going to jail. That seems to be the main, and I'm not talking about the whistleblowers, I'm talking about the individuals that have been responsible for suppressing all of this for so long. And you heard Jake say people have been killed over protecting, the fact that we were doing this as a the US government was. And so I think that fear of repercussions for the individuals involved is really the main thing here. And, I know a lot of that, dating back to Roswell, et cetera, you could make the argument, oh, that should be declassified, and it should. But the knock-on effects of that are these programs never ended, and have continued on across multiple, 3+ generations at this point. And the vested interests that, keep these quiet are immensely powerful.
Why doesn't the phenomenon just take disclosure into its own hands and just, present itself above this Super Bowl or a big Macy Day parade or something like that? Because, my perspective is the phenomenon is it's controlling exactly how knowledge of it percolates into society. Because if it wasn't controlling it, then the inevitability is we would have had disclosure decades ago, because it would have made a mistake, or it would have just been like, I don't care, I'm just going to show you a big flying saucer in broad daylight. It seems like it's engaging in a meticulous operation of sorts. Why do you think it just doesn't? Why do you think it's because I think Whitley Strieber has said that the phenomenon itself, or the architects of the secrecy, why are they playing this game to allow this dynamic to persist, where governments and corporations can cover it up, and then the rest of us don't have access to the same high fidelity data that the governments and corporations have?
Yeah, I ask myself this question all the time, and it's very frustrating. And I could give you, there have been numerous channeled texts that have all talked about this and, say that it's our responsibility and whatnot. I frankly don't know. I don't have a great answer. And, let's say that, all of this is looking out for our best interests. That's a claim. Who knows? The idea could be that the shock of this would be so drastic as to cause massive societal upheaval, potential revolutions, mass suicides, et cetera. And that life really is, so precious and worth protecting that it's worth dripping this out and getting people used to it. Now, conversely, people ask me, when do you think disclosure is going to happen? And I would argue it happened in 2017, and just no one cared. With the TikTok videos and ATIP, and I do remember that being in the news, but it just didn't really seem to take. And so my worry, which I think you're hinting at, is it's going to take something very drastic. Skywatcher, we're hoping to start this in a small way, to be able to show people at events like, here is the reality of it. We can't fake it. This isn't a AI generated video or image. Here is the reality of it. But doing it at that scale, perhaps the concern is that just the shock would be detrimental to humanity at large.
How many sessions do you anticipate having over the coming year where all you psionic assets get together and try to gather data of the phenomenon?
Yeah, it's tough to say at this point. We will probably do one every 1 to 2 months. Now, that's not to say that the PA team isn't the only team out there. People seem to, it hasn't really been widely talked about, but there is a technology team that, to use an intelligence term for it, I would probably call like a MASINT, measures and signatures intelligence, which is focused on collecting, telemetry data, radar data, et cetera. And they have some very advanced custom built equipment. And you'll be seeing, a lot of that actually like more scientific data should be coming, in the near future. It's not just going to be, wild spectacles. We actually are looking to do the hard science behind all this as well.
Do you think that, I don't know what the correct term is. I've heard HEIS, I heard CE5. You can let me know what your preferred term is. But do you think the attempt to make contact will become much more popular in the coming months and years? And do you think that's a good thing if it becomes like a very mainstream hobby, going out by yourself or with other people, going through your own protocols and trying to engage or interact with the phenomenon?
I do think it's a good thing, and I think it will become more popular. And I'll give you a very personal example. So my extended family is quite skeptical of all of this, and became aware of this information coming out, my involvement in it. And over the Christmas holiday, I had some family visiting and took them out and showed them the reality of this. And this is me speaking as a person that has never really been able to share this part of my life with my family, other than my wife, obviously. I can't tell you how much that meant to me, like as a person, to now have, my family no longer thinking that this is ridiculous, being like, oh my gosh, that was so profound to them and so shocking that it was very meaningful to me and to them for them to have that experience.
What was that experience exactly?
Being able to use human-initiated contact to summon an orb, within, I would say, probably 300 to 500 feet of them.
Okay, wow. Because Jake Barber just came out, he had 3 other people corroborating his testimony. Do you think more whistleblowers will come out in the remainder of 2025?
I think so. There are a number waiting in the wings, but I do think just the dialogue around this is very toxic, and it's very dissuading for people that are waiting in the wings with new information. And I think personally, how Jake's been treated, is kind of it's going to dissuade people from wanting to come out. But there is other information out there. Once again, as we were talking about, I think the psi side of this is kind of the third rail. There's plenty of other material, though, that doesn't touch on this.
I think you're right, though. I think that Jake coming out would have gotten a lot more press if he did not incorporate the spiritual component of his experiences. I mean,
look, I saw he got knocked for his own spiritual experiences. I personally found that, as someone that has had that, and for the, hundreds of other psychics that I talk to, within my network, to have someone come out and validate their experiences like that, can't tell you how much it meant to have someone with his background come out and say that. I guess what I more meant was the psionic angle to this story and how the CR teams were actually operating. I think that's just really hard to stomach. I think, people probably get behind, Jake's video and, the fact that, craft crashes, we go out there and recover it. That makes sense. That's what the military does. But the fact that, psionics might be involved in actually getting them there and bringing them down, that's a really hard. I mean, I see this as I've come out myself publicly. We get a lot of grief for it.
Do you know about other organizations that do what you do that haven't come public yet? Because I do recall Jake saying that this is not just a United States thing. There are organizations that are not even necessarily completely affiliated with their governments that are doing the same kind of work that the Legacy program is doing or that you're doing, trying to interact with the phenomenon.
Yes, there are definitely other groups out there that are doing this. They are not doing it in public, and I doubt they have any intention to do so. I think that's what makes Skywatcher unique, is we're actually trying to demonstrate this to everyone, as opposed to just viewing it as a technology transfer.
Do you see in the coming, months and years that mainstream science will get much more interested in what you're doing, to learn about it, what it means about the universe, and discovering new existences or even life forms or forms of consciousness?
I definitely hope so. I think that's I mean, that's really where Skywatcher right now, people seem to be very focused on the spectacle of it and the fact that we're looking to do events, but we already work with a number of scientists. There was a reason Dr. Gary Nolan was out there. There's a whole bunch of other scientists in the consciousness field that are aligned with this project, that I've met with and that we work with. And we are already funding a lot of research in that regard. And that was one of the initial ideas as we got into this topic was we don't want to just take baby steps anymore. We want to really fund the most meaningful research that previously didn't have a source of funding. I've met a lot of, call them parapsychologists, call them what you will. They tend to, because of the stigma around this, they have to maintain a very, very narrow swim lane as to what their interests were. And so, a lot of like the early, scientists attached to SRI, et cetera, remote viewing, was it. It's not going to progress beyond remote viewing. What we're looking to do is find those scientists and fund them to do the research that's actually going to drive meaningful advancement in our understanding of these topics.
What's your perspective on the abduction phenomenon? Because I've said in the past that in my perspective, the abduction phenomenon is probably the darkest aspect of the phenomenon. I think the abduction phenomenon is happening. I think the data seems to suggest that it's bloodline related primarily. And if you are in one of those bloodlines, the phenomenon is particularly interested in you. I don't know what it is. Is it species from another world? Are they species that are native to the earth? Who knows? But what's your, how is the world going to deal with that as disclosure progresses?
Yeah. I frankly don't have an answer. I think, once again, humans naturally look for a way to put things into buckets. And so the unknown nature of the entirety of all of these experiences, we label the phenomenon. And I've used that term 30 times in this interview because it's easy. I don't mean to make it sound like that. This really is a diversity of experiences and probably intelligences that we're interacting with. And similar to humanity, most people don't bucket humans as either good or bad. We're all shades of gray. And there are some people that are on the extreme ends of either spectrum, but most of us are kind of there in that happy middle. And so there's no reason to think that whatever this is, there's probably a lot that are just in that middle. There's the, really great, very positive ones that are only looking out for us. There's got to be that negative side as well. And that doesn't mean that we should bury our heads in the sand and say, all of this is evil, because that hasn't been my experience in doing this for, 30 years at this point.
What's your perspective on the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis? I mean, I think that's one of my favorite, only because the idea that there are native forms of consciousness or life forms in our planet, maybe they evolved in the oceans, or that to me is extraordinary. To me, it's more extraordinary than other dimensions or other planets. But what's your take on whether some of what we're dealing with might actually be homegrown?
I think that's not too far off. I think that actually makes a great deal more sense to me than a lot of these hypotheses and our current understanding of physics and the distances involved, et cetera. If you're going to say this is purely physical phenomenon, its ability to, the reports of, I think Jake actually talked about, them manifesting out of the ground. My God, what are the implications of that? We're very focused on, these undersea installations as an example. And there's no reason those couldn't have been homegrown. They don't have to be a forward operating base for something else. We really don't know. And then this also plays into, and I think I mentioned it earlier, the stories of these kind of parallel civilizations just outside of reality that permeate all the cultures around the world, Fae, Jinn, etc. Most cultures have these stories. Whether how material they are is obviously a subject for debate.
Do you think there's something stopping, I'll use the phenomenon, but like you said, it's probably multiple things. Do you think there's something stopping it from engaging us more directly? Because when you think about it, if it's ultra-terrestrials, interdimensional, some of it's coming from other planets, some of it's angelic, some of it's coming from the afterlife. They all seem to agree that they're not going to force disclosure, at least yet. Do you think there's something like stopping them from actually doing that, some kind of force or hierarchy of intelligences, and they all kind of fall in line? Or do you think they've all kind of agreed that there's a time and a place for disclosure, and they're going to do it? They're not going to like one species or whatever is not going to do it before the hierarchy agrees it's best. What do you think?
Yeah, that kind of Star Trek idea of the prime directive, that they can't, interfere directly with us. I don't know. My own personal opinion, I would say that makes sense to me, that there is some type of understanding that humanity needs to come to this on its own. Now, once again, diversity, that's not to say everyone's, going to agree with that. It's the same thing, when you're a kid, don't go there. It has no trespassing signs. Well, what are you going to do? Teenagers are going to go check it out and see what happens there. And so I think that might be something we're dealing with is these are potentially just, kind of more individuals as opposed to some organized systemic response.
James, this has been a great interview. As an ending or closing question, what is Skywatcher's number one objective that you would like to accomplish, and also allow my audience to know where they can find you?
Yeah, so the number one objective over the next year, and really for 2025, I'll shorten it a couple months, is to demonstrate this for a diverse group of people in a way that cannot be brushed off. By diverse group of people, I mean not taking a whole bunch of people like me or you that are already large believers in these topics, but people that have publicly expressed that they don't think that this is possible, or that there is no reality to this. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. That's that aha moment where I feel like people will actually grow to accept this, because once again, we're going to show you the video. We will show you as much as we can, but there's always going to be some set of people that say that's not compelling, that's AI generated. And so fine, we'll show it to you in the real world. As to where to find me, X is probably the best spot. My handle is at JD Hodgkins, Hodgkins. And yeah, thank you. I enjoyed the interview.